All right. This is the American YAWP, chapter 17, The West. So, in this chapter, we're focusing specifically on the geographic region west of the Mississippi River. So, the Mississippi River, we'll call this the border between quote unquote the West and the United States. And we're kind of jumping in to this particular region, kind of right in the middle of the story in some ways. We're going to be focusing specifically on the time period after the Civil War. Remember, 1861 to 1865 was when the American Civil War was fought. Now, there's an entire history between the United States and quote unquote the West that kind of precedes and leads up to this period here, that was in some ways kind of put on pause by the American Civil War. But there really is kind of one fundamental difference that comes after 1865, and that is the construction of the railroads. And the construction of the railroads in the West after the American Civil War, in some ways, doesn't really change what's going on there, but just sort of accelerates a lot of the processes that had already been kind of going on in that region to begin with. And we'll kind of clarify exactly what we mean. But we'll say about railroads, these were built in the West after the Civil War and really accelerated um, much of the, say, development. Oops. So in some ways, the railroads do kind of profoundly change the West, but these are some changes that have kind of already been going on for quite some time, but are just kind of ratcheted up. So it's kind of very important to understand that really a lot of we can say that much of the history is driven by the railroad, right? That like in pretty much every single thing that we cover in this chapter, what is sort of looming in the background is the way in which railroads have kind of, again, in some ways changed, but maybe a little bit more accurately accelerated a lot of things that were already going on. This quote here kind of nicely summarizes the changes that take place in the West in this post-Civil War period. It says, quote, what some touted as a triumph was for others a tragedy. And that is, for a long time, and especially back then, the development, and again, even this term sort of development in quotes, was celebrated as sort of a grand human achievement of man over nature. But when you look at the entire history of the West, not just accounting for the triumphs, but also accounting for the tragedies, it's clear that this particular period did affect a lot of other people in negative ways. And we might be able to make some connections between kind of the ways in which the West changed, and the impacts that it had on kind of those that were not maybe the most visible in American society at the time, and attach that to the broader theme of this period, and that is the Gilded Age. And in some ways, um, what happened in the West after the Civil War fits very nicely with this theme of the Gilded Age because on the surface level, it looks like a triumph. But when you scratch the surface, you realize that it's not really a golden age, but that maybe this sort of golden aura is only on the surface. So look at the first section here, section 2, post-Civil War westward migration. So again, these are going to be things that we can kind of see that were already happening, but because of the construction of the railroads, are only going to be further accelerated. So the West meant many different things to many different people. One was the West represented raw materials. The West was so big that many people believed that it would never, quote unquote, be conquered. That was, of course, until some of the technological developments of the Gilded Age that allowed people to kind of overcome a lot of those natural barriers. But we might say that the West was and is a maybe reservoir for many natural resources. So, and these resources can come in many different forms. We'll talk about two in specific. We'll talk about gold and bison, but this could also be things like, coal, lumber or timber could be in the West. Certain fish like salmon could be found in the West. A little bit later on, things like oil, also other minerals like copper. So there really was kind of like an endless supply, or at least what was perceived to be an endless supply of resources out west. So two that we'll talk about in particular, gold and the bison. Now, gold, we know this from an earlier chapter, that gold was the basis of the monetary system. And one of the features about gold that is different than really a lot of these other kind of resources is that gold is a resource in which a very, very small amount of it can yield a very high profitability. So there were people who were going out west even before the railroads because what they could bring back would be valuable enough to make that trip worth it. So some notable examples of gold rushes, and a gold rush is when people will say when people move to an area where gold is discovered. So gold's discovered, a bunch of people move there in the hopes of trying to strike it rich. So probably the most famous gold rush occurred in California in 1849. This was before the American Civil War. In fact, it was because of this gold rush that we pretty much had statehood in California. So a lot of people moved there, skipped over a lot of the territory in the West and just made it right towards California. And two other gold rushes that come in Colorado in 1858 and the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1874. And one thing that we'll find, and this is true in California as well, is that when a lot of people move to an area very, very quickly, it typically does not bode well for settler Native American relations. We'll talk more in some of the future sections about kind of that impact. And it was only after the construction of the railroads that you could extract more gold, right? That was the only difference there. The bison are probably a better example of the ways in which railroads changed resource extraction. So bison were hunted for things like, meat, leather, and other sort of, uses. Their bones could be used, their fat could be used. So certainly there were people, or there was a market for bison. But what had limited the amount of bison hunting that could take place was that, they're pretty big animals. And so to kill one and then try and drag it like all the way back to New York City in order to sell it was very, very expensive. Well, once railroads became part of the equation, essentially one could shoot and kill every single bison that existed on the Great Plains of North America. And that is essentially what they did. This image here is showing you just the sheer mass of bison skulls that were hunted on the Great Plains, in this post-Civil War era. And again, it's not as if anything changed in terms of like the desire to hunt bison. That was always there. What changed, though, was the railroad. And the railroad allowed for people to kill because it became profitable, right? You could put this many bison on a train and then bring them back to a market somewhere in the eastern part of the United States. And so it's estimated that in the year 1850, there were about 10 million bison. By the 1880s, there was probably about only 500 left. And so they were nearly hunted into extinction. And we'll talk a little bit later about kind of the impact that this has. But again, you can apply this to everything else. You can apply, think about this massive pile of skulls here and apply that to coal and copper and lumber and salmon and oil and all of these other natural resources. It's just that the extraction of resources accelerated tremendously. And this could have, adverse effects. Here we mentioned that just the sheer number of people moving into these areas definitely put strain on settler Native American relations. In the case of something like the buffalo or the bison, we could definitely say that this undermined the society, economy, and politics of Native Americans who relied on the bison. So, for a group or a tribe of people, Native Americans who had lived on the Great Plains really for centuries, um, this sudden decrease in the number of buffalo or bison available really did a lot to damage the ability for those tribes and groups to remain independent and remain sovereign. Um, and this is maybe a good term to use, the market. The market is where you buy and sell things. The market kind of comes to dominate all things. And because of the railroads, it really sort of rapidly accelerates in the West. So fundamentally, when we think about the West, we can definitely think about it as a reservoir of raw materials. The second thing that we can think about the West is in terms of a place of refuge. And that is, you can move out West, or one could move out West in order to escape whatever problems one might have in kind of traditional society. So this was the case for criminals, right? The quote unquote outlaws. So if you committed a crime and the police were after you, again, one place that you can move to was the West. You could abandon the responsibilities. So, for example, things like families. If you were a man and you were unable or unwilling to take care of your wife and your children, you just pack your bags and move out West and abandon those responsibilities. And another thing is to escape any type of persecution. And that's exactly what the Mormons did. And they ended up moving out to Salt Lake City, Utah. This was a little bit before the Civil War, and established an independent community based off the fact that they were facing religious persecution, back in the eastern part of the United States. So Mormonism is sometimes described as a uniquely American faith. It was founded by Joseph Smith. He is the founder of Mormonism. And the Mormons had practiced a different kind of version of Christianity, and that put them at odds with other groups of Americans at the time. The Mormons were, we'll say, persecuted and chose to move to Salt Lake City, Utah, to escape it. In fact, this was done after Joseph Smith was murdered by a what do we want to call it? A crowd of people, by a mob, by a mob. And I believe this happened in 1844. I want to say. And so after Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob, the Mormons packed their bags and moved to Utah. So the West was always kind of this place of refuge. There was always this sense that you could go out west and start over. In fact, kind of a very common saying at the time was, quote unquote, "Go west, young man." Right? There was sort of this sense that you could start over again. The last thing that we'll say about the West in terms of what it could potentially mean, and this was probably true for the vast majority of people that moved out there, was it was land. There was plenty of space available there. And once again, it's not that people never moved out west for land to begin with, but now land was easier to get to. And in terms of what people did, we'll say many moved west for land. And what they wanted to do was farm. And remember, when it came to farming, one of the ways that you could get it into the city was via the railroad. So the fact that railroads were now sprawling out all over west of the Mississippi River, it meant that that land was now kind of available for farming. And there were other sort of incentives. I mean, we've talked about this earlier, but the Homestead Act, we'll just mention it again here, it gave free and cheap land to those willing to move and improve it. So a lot of people were incentivized through government programs like the Homestead Act to move out west, and the railroads sort of permitted that to happen. So when we think about kind of the big, again, kind of change after 1865, or maybe if we want to kind of like graph these things, graph sort of the population movements and graph the resource extraction, we could say that for a long time, maybe these things were kind of steadily increasing. And then at the point of railroad construction, it just significantly increases, right? So we might call this, or this would represent our settlement and resource extraction in the West. And of course, the point, sort of inflection point, right? This would be railroads built here. Section 3, the Indian Wars and Federal Peace Policy. So, this term Indian Wars is generally used to describe a series of conflicts that broke out between the United States and Native Americans in the post Civil War period. We'll say this is the series of conflicts United States, Native Americans after the Civil War. And that part is kind of important here. So there are plenty of wars between Native Americans and the United States. But when we use this term Indian Wars, specifically, it's specifically these conflicts here. And it's not one giant war, it's kind of a series of outbursts of fighting that takes place between the United States and various tribes from regions like the Great Plains to Colorado down to the Southwest and California. And so, kind of collectively, because of all of this violence, we sort of use this term Indian War to describe that. Now, just as sort of a side note here in regards to terminology, because I do sometimes get sort of asked this question, what's the difference between Indian and Native American? Broadly speaking, when we use the term Native American, again, broadly speaking, We use Native American when we're referring specifically to people. So Native Americans did this, it had an impact on Native Americans. So when referring to individual people, typically the appropriate term is Native American. Indian is sometimes still used, but mostly as a descriptor. So something like Indian culture or Indian land or Indian wars. Because we're not talking about actual people, we're just using it as a descriptor. That's when you'll still sometimes find that term being used. But broadly speaking, when talking about individual people or groups of people, we tend to want to use Native American, but sometimes we'll find it in some areas. This is especially true for things that have been kind of described, kind of a couple decades ago. A lot of those terms end up sticking. So, in terms of the relationship between Native Americans and the United States, there again is a much longer history that could be told here. We're sort of jumping in post Civil War period after 1865, or kind of about that region. But we can mostly summarize U.S. Native American relations, at least in terms of the United States government, kind of in three major categories. The first one is through a series of treaties. And this was kind of the earliest government policy or United States policy between the US and Native Americans. That is to say, that Native Americans are treated kind of like a foreign country would be treated. So, in the same way that the United States might sign a treaty with France, they would also sign a treaty with the Sioux or the Iroquois or the Creek. And going back kind of all the way to the inception of the United States, this was kind of the way to go. So by the time we get to the Civil War, there are new treaties that are being signed, but also a lot of older treaties that continue to exist. A second sort of policy is the policy of reservations. And whether or not this was done through treaty, through warfare, through force, through consent, whatever is required, throughout the United States, there were certain lands that were set aside in which Native Americans were recognized by the United States government as being able to reside in that area. Again, whether this was done through force or whether this was done through something like a treaty, reservations tend to kind of litter throughout the United States. And a reservation would be a little bit different than a treaty because in a treaty, there is a recognition of one-to-one sovereignty. So we might say, or we might use this term, this is a good term to be familiar with, sovereignty, R-I-Y, and sovereignty is the ability to rule oneself, right? So if you are a sovereign person or sovereign country or sovereign tribe, that means you get to make all of your decisions. Now, these sorts of treaties would have recognized Native Americans as sovereign. They have the right to make their own laws, make their own policies, do whatever they want. The reservations are different because the reservations do have a little bit more oversight when it comes to the role that the United States government has, and the degree to which the United States controls the reservations does depend. Sometimes can be very heavy-handed. Sometimes it's not very heavy-handed at all. And the last policy is the policy of Indian removal, and this was a probably one of the darkest chapters of U.S. Native American relations. Indian removal was a policy in the 1830s and 40s to forcibly move Native Americans to reservations. Right, forcibly move Native Americans to reservations. So whether we're talking about treaties, reservations, or the policy of Indian removal, one thing that we could sort of mention, or something that would be relevant, at least to our chapter here, is that the policy of Indian removal in the 1830s and 1840s, where the Native Americans were removed, was specifically west of the Mississippi. So this policy essentially removed Native Americans that were living I guess you could say, in the borders of the United States, west of the Mississippi River into what is now the state of Oklahoma. So those are kind of the three major, we might say, like governmental approaches that the United States has had to Native Americans. Now, pressures in terms of Native American populations, and we can also substitute sovereignty here. Again, sovereignty being the ability to rule oneself. And kind of one note that we'll make about this time period in particular is that this is a time period when, we'll just say by 1900, Native American sovereignty comes to an end. That is, in some way, shape, or form, Native peoples living within the continental United States would become subject to the United States government, local, federal, um, again, kind of varying degrees of control. And this is the ending of, really depending on how you look at it, a very long chapter in not just the history of the United States, but the history of Native Americans. So, you could say that, ever since the first people moved to the Americas way back during the Ice Age, they exercised some degree of sovereignty. And then by 1900, that sovereignty evaporated or was squashed. Or you could look back to when the first Europeans arrived, that essentially from 1492, when Christopher Columbus set foot on Hispaniola, that Native Americans interacted with Europeans, whether that was through trade, peace, war, whatever, just whatever interaction you want to describe, trade, that at least Native Americans always had some semblance of sovereignty. That comes to a conclusion in the continental United States by about 1900, or more specifically, we can maybe use 1890. Actually, we will make this. We'll use 1890. Talk later in the chapter why we use right as a as. So there had always been pressure on Native American peoples from European settlers, even before the Civil War. But again, remember the impact that the railroad had. And kind of the main focus of this chapter is the violent confrontations that break out between the United States and Native Americans. But it's important to understand that those violent confrontations are happening against a backdrop of a series of pressures on the Native American way of life and on Native Americans to be able to live really kind of self-sufficiently and independently. So we'll go ahead and just kind of talk about some of these things here. First and foremost are things like US government policies. And it's not just the most explicit in terms of like the policy of Indian removal, which is probably the most clear in terms of how that damaged the ability for Native Americans to remain independent, being moved from homelands in places like Georgia to Oklahoma, and then being expected to try and survive or maintain a way of life was incredibly disruptive and incredibly damaging. But even just reservation policies and even some of these treaties put pressure on Native American sovereignty. Another one that we mentioned last section is the market economy. Again, a market is anywhere where you buy and sell something. So when you think about market, think about buying and selling. And so the market the market does have its benefits. You do get greater access to a bunch of goods. Typically, you have a higher material standard of living. But what comes with the market economy is a loss of self-sufficiency. It is no longer the ability to maintain a way of life kind of free from all sort of outside influences. And kind of a good example of this is uh, for groups or tribes that produce certain goods like pottery or rugs, that with the introduction of the market economy, it turned out that it was more profitable to only create rugs or only make pottery and then sell it and then buy everything else, which again might give you more stuff in the long run. But what it does is that it makes it so that you can't kind of survive without the market. And the growth and influx of the market economy, again, also served to undermine. We have just settlers, generally speaking. The more and more settlers that moved out, it put pressure on people and resources. So just the sheer number of people that were moving onto Native American lands also helped to undermine it. And lastly, we can look at resources. At least for groups like those on the Great Plains, things like the almost extinction of the buffalo or bison made it practically more difficult to survive. So again, against kind of the backdrop of all the violence and war, and kind of the war and the violence tends to get most of the focus. It is kind of the more interesting or fascinating aspects of history, but there are a lot of other things that are happening that are helping to undermine Native American sovereignty. So we'll talk about some of these examples of conflicts that broke out during the Indian Wars, just to get sort of a sense for what these sort of incidents entailed. One of the first are the Dakota War, or one of the first conflicts we can mention is the Dakota War. This happened in 1862, and this was primarily Native Americans on the Great Plains, namely the Dakota, and the U.S. government. So the Dakota were already experiencing all the things that we talked about previously, including the lack of buffalo or bison to hunt. And so for the Dakota by the 1860s, things like food were becoming very, very scarce. Now, the Dakota and the United States government had treaties and deals set up so that the US would provide food for the Dakota, or at least allow them to purchase it, maybe using something like credit. We might say that when food ran low and US the agents refused to provide it, the Dakota launched raids. And that was the beginning of the Dakota War, a series of violent confrontations between Dakota and the United States government. One of the quotes that was allegedly to have been said in response to the Dakota running low on food came from Andrew Myrick. And he said, quote, "Let them eat grass." And this was kind of, again, alleged to have said this, but this was to sort of represent kind of the attitudes that the federal Indian agents had towards groups like the Dakota. Um, Through a series of violent confrontations, eventually the United States military did gain the upper hand, and the Dakota were defeated. 303 of them were sentenced to death for their role in the war. At the time, President Lincoln commuted, and to commute means to kind of excuse the sentence, commuted the executions of all but 38 Dakota who were executed. And I believe that is the largest mass execution in American history. Oh, my A mixed up. Dakota. So the Dakota War is just one example of that. Your textbook has a picture here of some of those that were part of the United States military, very specifically those that were called by Native Americans Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers are African American soldiers in the US Army. And because of the Civil War, this was the first peacetime the African American, I will say regiment, although I don't. proper term. Because of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the enlistment of African American troops during the American Civil War, and especially following the abolition of slavery, you did have a number of African American men who enlisted in the U.S. Army, and of which many of them, or not maybe not many of them, but some of them participated in some of these conflicts collectively known as wars. Another focal point of violence occurred in Colorado. There it was between the United States and the Cheyenne. And Colorado was an area that was maybe a little bit more kind of beyond, we might say, kind of American settlement. But in 1858, gold was discovered. And settlers poured in, creating all sorts of problems. Now, at the time, the United States actually had a treaty, the first Treaty of Fort Laramie, and this treaty allowed settlers to pass through, typically in exchange for like money and food and stuff like that. Allowed settlers to pass through on their way to California, Oregon. See, the idea was that California and Oregon were the kind of more desirable land, especially when it came to something like farming. And so the first Treaty of Fort Laramie was really supposed to say, hey, just let these settlers kind of pass through your lands. They're on their way to California, they're on their way to Oregon, they have no interest in settling in Colorado. And that was a treaty that worked until gold was discovered. And when settlers began to pour in, you had sporadic outbursts of violence break out between settlers and Native Americans. The Cheyenne, for their part, they had hoped to establish peace or were looking to create some sort of new settlement that might sort of resolve this issue. However, the United States Colonel John Shivington, who, hearing about reports of violence, understanding, uh, um, hearing reports of violence, the way in which settlers were pouring in, he was very much convinced that he needed to attack the Cheyenne before the Cheyenne and other groups might attack him. And what he was responsible for was probably one of the more infamous one of the more infamous atrocities in all of the quote unquote Indian War period, and that was the Sand Creek Massacre. And the Sand Creek Massacre was when Shivington ordered, an attack and massacre on a Cheyenne. Am I spelling that correctly? Two N's, sorry. On a Cheyenne village, killing 200 men, women, children. And one of the things that made the Sand Creek Massacre more atrocious was the fact that many of the men, the Cheyenne men, were not in the village at the time. And so a lot of the victims were the elderly, the women, the children, et cetera, et cetera. Shivington, for his role and responsibility in ordering this, this created somewhat of a controversy in the United States. Some celebrated what Shivington had done, and others but a lot of Americans felt that Shivington was justified in this massacre, And that kind of gives you a little bit of insight in terms of how the broader American population might view these conflicts and view Native Americans more broadly. Now, one thing was true resulting from both the Sand Creek Massacre and the Dakota War, and that is violence certainly seemed to be on the rise. And so the United States government had really kind of hoped to avoid violence up until this point. And even though things like the discovery of gold might sort of complicate matters, it was true that both Native Americans and the United States sought peace when possible. And so, in response to the uptick in violence, the Indian Peace Commission was established. This was designed to prevent violence in the West. That was the idea. And in terms of how that would happen, what the Peace Commission came to the conclusion was that assimilation was the best course of action. And assimilation, broadly speaking, means to blend in to the dominant culture. And this image here is a perfect example of what assimilation means. And the idea is that if Native Americans were just to become more American and just kind of blend in with the general population, then you wouldn't have these two sides fighting each other. But an important point to kind of make about assimilation and assimilation policies was that this was a policy that was not only expected, but sometimes even forced for Native Americans to completely abandon everything about their history, culture, and tradition and give it up for American culture. It was not sort of like two cultures meeting in the middle, let's say, which typically might be true of something that is like negotiated, right? That typically both sides are required to compromise on this. But this was an expectation and a policy that really was one way. It required Native Americans to completely give up their way of life and assimilate into the broader American society. And so there were kind of several ways in which this could potentially happen. The first one was what we might call Christianization. And in terms of religion, to give up Native American religion and convert to Christianity, in fact, many churches we could say were, many churches will say facilitated assimilation on reservations. So, one way that one might assimilate is by religion, to become a Christian. Another way was to sort of adopt a different type of what we might call social unit. And that was the expectation for Native American to give up kind of the tribe or the clan, kind of the more broader extended family, um, or what we might call a household unit. A husband, a wife, children, kind of a much smaller social unit as opposed to sort of a tribe. And another good example of this is in terms of gender or gender roles. And gender typically refers to the role that men and women have in society. And so, one, for example, was that Native American women were typically the farmers. And there was pressure for Native American women essentially to become kind of like, I don't know what's a good way to put it, sort of household, maybe managers. Another good or another way of kind of putting it is that in American society, traditionally it was the men who were the farmers. In Native American society, it was the uh, women who were the farmers. So the idea was to become more American meant that Native American women had to stop farming and they had to do what typically like stereotypical American women did, and that was again kind of be in charge of the household, so to speak. So there are lots of different kind of avenues or ways that assimilation can go. I mean, from this image here, it could be something as simple as a hairstyle, right? Or something like fashion, right? Fashion, hairstyles, language, religion, social units, gender, a lot of these different sort of cultural markers. And again, the idea behind it was to prevent violence. Now, this obviously was a problem for a lot of Native Americans who did not think that it was wise to completely abandon hundreds of years of tradition in an effort to appease, American settlers that were encroaching on Western territories. In fact, you saw some of the maybe frustration or puzzlement that American officials had when Native Americans refused or were not as quick to adopt American culture or lifestyle as maybe they would have hoped. This quote here kind of illustrates that. It looks like it's from a guy named J.L. Brodus, overseer of the tribes in 1875. He says they, as the Native Americans, would rather live upon the roots and acorns gathered by their women than work for flour and beef. Again, flour and beef being kind of the American foodstuffs, roots, acorns gathered by women, women doing the farming or the food gathering. Again, kind of illustrates this point. Now, even though there was hope for peace, those that were not willing to abide by American reservationist policies or just kind of the continued pressure that Native Americans had, led to a um, continuing persistence of violence, right? It's not as if violence disappeared. One of the most famous examples, and probably the most famous examples from all of the Indian Wars, was the Battle of Little Bighorn that happened in six. Now, this was a conflict between, again, Native Americans living on the Great Plains. And on the Great Plains, we want to think about this is traditionally kind of flat land. Typically, these people rely on hunting more often than agriculture, things like the buffalo. And so some of this was also a kind of a remnant from the Dakota War, so the Great Plains versus the United States. Following the Dakota War, the United States negotiated additional treaties with groups like the Sioux, who are again a group that lived on the Great Plains, in order to create a reservation that was further away in the aftermath of the Dakota War. And this is very much true for pretty much all of American history from the beginning, is this desire to relocate Native Americans just kind of further away from American settlement. So the Great Sioux Reservation was, we'll just say, a reservation negotiated after the Dakota War. Actually, another war that broke out that led to this treaty. And again, insofar as the reservation is further away from American settlements, that at least seems fine on the side of the United States. But much like in Colorado and in other places like California, didn't take very long before gold was discovered in the Black Hills. The gold discovered in the Black Hills. And once again, settlers poured in. And this put even more pressure on groups like, the Dakota, the Sioux, others in that particular region. The United States had hoped to renegotiate a treaty that would hand over the Black Hills to the United States since gold was discovered, as a way of trying to avoid further confrontation. In fact, the United States opted to purchase the land, but those offers were refused. And in the refusal of those offers, the United States Army would pursue bands of, Sioux, Lakota, other Native Americans. Those bands were led by two Native American leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. So, say, um, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led resistance to the United States on the Great Plains. And, this is pretty much how a lot of, maybe not a lot, but kind of a frequent source of the outbreaks of these wars is that groups of Native Americans, whether they signed the treaty or they didn't, are ordered onto reservations by the United States government, and it's their refusal to abide by kind of that reservation order that sends the United States military after them. And so, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were ordered onto reservations. They said, no, we're not going to do that. And so the United States sent out Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who was I don't know about a celebrity or a hero, but he was definitely kind of a well-known general. We'll just say well-known U.S. general, sent to defeat, we'll just say Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. So George Custer was in charge of a cavalry unit. Cavalry are troops that are on horseback. And because, the United States had had a lot of success in the Indian Wars more broadly, Lieutenant Custer was very confident, even overconfident. In fact, I don't think that a U.S. cavalry unit had ever lost a battle during the entire course of the Indian Wars. And when he ordered his men to attack Sitting Bull at Crazy Horse at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer and all 268 of his men were killed. And this battle was significant because when Custer was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn, it came as a huge shock to the entire country. The United States had been having, pretty good success in terms of the Indian Wars more broadly. The expectation was for victory, and because Custer was somewhat well known, he was well known from the Civil War. When American audiences heard news that Custer was killed, they were shocked by it. Right? It was kind of shocking news, and so the Battle of Little Bighorn is significant not just because it's one of the kind of rare instances in which American forces are defeated. That did happen in other areas, but most of the time the United States was victorious. But because this has sometimes been called the beginning, oops, beginning of the end. And what is meant by that is that when Custer was killed, the United States government doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down on its effort in order to go out and really, attack and handle any kind of groups of sovereign Native Americans that were refusing to abide by American policy. So it not only was sort of like a sense of revenge, but it was a sense from the United States government that they are going to allocate a lot more resources and a lot more effort to go out and defeat and arrest and force onto reservations groups of Native Americans like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse that were still trying to exercise some level of sovereignty. Moving on to section 4, Beyond the Plains. So this section just talks a little bit more about some of the other confrontations that occurred outside of the Great Plains region. So we'll start with the Southwest here. And typically this is areas like Arizona or New Mexico. One incident there involved the Navajo, who were ordered onto reservations by the U.S. But these reservations were very far away from the Navajo homeland. So they were required to march on what became known as the Long Walk. And this was about a 300-mile march onto reservations which actually turned out to have very horrific conditions. I mean, most reservations were already not very good to begin with, like inadequate food, inadequate medicine, a lot of sickness and disease. Um, but these ones were especially horrible. We'll say 300-mile march on the reservations, which were we'll say filled with say disease, just general poor conditions. In fact, the conditions were so terrible on the reservations the Navajo were required to move on that in a very kind of rare move, American military officials actually permitted, via the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, actually permitted the Navajo to return to their homeland. So this was a treaty that allowed or permitted Navajo to return homeland. Another area outside the Great Plains that we can maybe say a few things about is that of California. Now, Native Americans who lived in California were very much adversely affected by the gold rush. And so a lot of the consequences that would eventually kind of impact Native Americans everywhere, in California, it came just a little bit earlier because of the gold rush. We'll say that the gold rush was nothing short of a disaster for natives in California. Through a combination of disease, of warfare, of murder, the population in California as a result of the gold rush went from about 150,000 Native Americans down to about 20,000. Facing these conditions, certain groups fought back. The Modoc, very specifically, fought a guerrilla war for over 11 months, almost a year, in an effort to try to gain some sort of semblance of sovereignty. So resistance in California as well. And then we can also move up north to the Pacific Northwest, which was also not free of American incursion. Here we're talking about states like Washington, Oregon, Idaho, right? These areas. And probably the most famous example of Native American resistance in this region, and maybe one of the more well-known examples, was the case of the Nez Perce. And this was a Native American tribe Native Americans who, say, refused reservation orders and tried to flee to Canada. Their leader, Chief Joseph, call him of the Nez Perce, Perce, gives us a quote that kind of encapsulates really sort of a sentiment that many Native Americans felt as the century was coming to a close by the late 1800s. The Nez Perce were not successful in reaching Canada. They were eventually captured by the United States military and forced to go to reservations, I believe, in Oklahoma. Chief Joseph, who was the leader of the Nez Perce, eventually did try and make a plea to the United States president, sort of telling his story about what happened, and did try and get back to his homeland, but never did. But Chief Joseph gives us the following quote, which says, "I am tired, my heart is sick and sad, From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. And specifically, this part here, the I will fight no more forever, has been kind of one of those quotes that has kind of lived on in not just like history textbooks, but sort of the American popular culture ever since this period. Section 5, Western economic expansion, railroads and cattle. So we mentioned earlier the importance of railroads in this post-Civil War period and how it really accelerates a lot of the changes that had kind of already been happening, but to a degree that really is unprecedented. One of the kind of key indicators of this was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is a railroad that connected, say, Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. In other words, this was a railroad that connected across the entire United States, and it was completed in Utah in 1869. And essentially what they did is that on the East Coast, they built a railroad out west. In California, they built a railroad out east, and where the two met was in Utah in 1869. They, to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, they drove in a golden spike to be kind of the last spike in order to construct that. And it was, it was considered a great kind of engineering marvel for the time. It was really a great triumph, right? Again, getting back to that quote about the West, for some it was a triumph, and for others it was a tragedy. One thing to keep in mind in terms of the railroad construction in the West is that a lot of it was done through government subsidies, and a subsidy is sort of an incentive or reward to, in this case, if we're talking about government subsidies for the railroad industries, this is an incentive or reward to railroad companies to build out west. And typically this was, something like money or land. So for example, one of the common kind of incentives in terms of land was that if you were a railroad company and you built out west, the government would essentially give you 1 mile of land on either side of that railroad. So railroad companies were not just in the business of owning and building railroads, but they also became kind of major landholders, and then could use that land for sort of whatever else they wanted. And once again, we're kind of reminded of this sort of contradiction in this Gilded Age period of those who advocated for social Darwinism, which was a hands-off approach that the government should not intervene. But yet when it came to government subsidies to help out businesses, a lot of people kind of very easily put aside their social Darwinistic viewpoint and were more than willing to accept incentives whenever they were favorable. The railroad industry, as we sort of described earlier, this was really kind of the first big business, maybe not just in the United States, but even in the world. The wealth and power that railroad companies had, they pretty much are a foundation of this Gilded Age era. But the construction of the railroads did take a lot of labor and a lot of work, and it wasn't the robber barons themselves who were building the railroads. It was, typically immigrant labor, especially in this period. Railroad workers accounted for about 2.5% of all workers worked for the rail industry. And they came from, all sorts of different backgrounds, but primarily in the West, there are kind of two major ethnic groups that were represented. The first were the Irish, who you might find, more commonly constructing kind of the eastern leg of the Transcontinental Railroad as it came from the United States over to Utah. But more and more and more in the West, there's kind of a newer demographic group showing up, and that is the Chinese. And many people from China came to the United States, specifically in the West, in the post Civil War period. Things like steamships made it a lot cheaper and easier for people to travel. And a lot of Chinese people who ended up in the United States ended up working for the railroad companies and were providing the labor required when it came to building railroads in California and Oregon and Nevada and some of those other places. It's hard to really emphasize the importance that railroads had, not just to the economy, but also to the landscape. Um, Now, there had been settlers out west, from Native Americans to European settlers to French fur traders to Spanish missionaries. All these sort of people had sort of littered the West. And so places like Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Los Angeles and San Francisco, that, these cities were already beginning to kind of take shape. But the railroads, in some cases, could create cities pretty much out of nowhere. And we refer to these as hub cities. These are cities created out of railroad networks. And again, for some of these areas, these were cities that really, just kind of sprouted up overnight. That as soon, if there was an area where two railroads met each other, and there might have been no other kind of surrounding area before that, that was reason enough to settle around that area because of all the economic kind of prosperity that could be brought by the railroads. A good example of this is Chicago. And it's not that Chicago didn't exist as a city before the railroads. In fact, I'm not entirely sure exactly what Chicago was like before, before this period. Probably some French fur trading post or something like that. But this is a map of what it says: Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and it has Chicago here at the center of it. This is Chicago right here. And one of the ways in which Chicago served as a very vital hub city was that Chicago was where a lot of animal products were sent. And so there were railroads that were sprawling out west here. And these railroads would typically bring certain resources, specifically what we're going to talk about here in a moment, and that was cattle, right? So cattle might be brought from, places like Texas. I don't know if this looks like a cow or not. They'd be brought up to the railroads. They'd be put on the railroads, sent to Chicago. Chicago was where all the factories were in terms of like producing meat. So the cows would be broken down into, the skin for the leather, the bones for whatever, the fat for candles, the meat for eating. And then they'd be sent out to these other railroads that connected Chicago with the rest of the public. And so after things were kind of produced, then they'd be sent here. So this is kind of part of what we talked earlier about Chicago being an economy, or an example of economies of scale. The biggest, baddest, most technologically sophisticated factories to produce animal products were in Chicago. So it really didn't make sense to produce animal products anywhere else. So one last thing that we'll mention here in this section is cattle. And when we think about the West in terms of the various resources that are there, probably none kind of inhabit our popular imagination more so than cattle. Now, cattle as a resource was always highly desired. We can think of it in terms of just like, steaks and stuff like that, but cattle were used for other purposes. But again, without railroads, it was very difficult to get and expensive to get cattle to markets in places like New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia or some of these other areas. Railroads made that easier, but still the cattle weren't located where some of the first and early railroads were built in places like California and Nebraska, but they were located further south. And so for a brief period of time, maybe from, we'll say maybe like the 1850s till about maybe the 1890s, cattle drives in particular were kind of a common feature of the American Western landscape. And what it required was, you know, thousands of cattle to be quote unquote driven, like migrated from Texas. And Texas was where a lot of these cattle were, up north to the trains. And I don't know exactly how many miles this was, but this would have been over the course of hundreds of miles. And so, in order to drive the cattle from their homeland up to the trains into places like, I think Lawrence, Kansas was kind of where the most southern train was. Um, and then put the cattle on the train, send them to Chicago, turn them into products. This involved workers known as cowboys. And in many respects, the cowboys were the ones responsible for the cattle drives, say responsible for cattle drives. But the cowboy became really a symbol of the West more broadly. I will say the cowboy became a symbol of the West. And in fact, was such a powerful symbol that really, this is true of countries around the world, say, and the United States more broadly. Americans are sometimes stereotyped as a bunch of cowboys. And so when it came to cowboys, there is kind of this, there's this myth and sort of reality to it. Right? There's the mythical cowboy that we get in popular culture that is celebrated for their independence, their adventure, their bravery. It's sort of a romanticized version of it. And certainly we get that a lot from our popular culture. But there are two things that we can say here about the reality of what it was like being an actual cowboy between the 1850s and 1890s. The first one was that cowboys were much more racially and ethnically diverse than typically what they were portrayed in American culture. This included not just the kind of prototypical or stereotypical Anglo cowboy. Anglo would be English-speaking Protestant, but many were Mexican in origin, and there were also many that were African American. We can kind of connect some earlier chapters together and say, well, one, the abolition of slavery meant that millions of African American men were now free. And so they were able to pursue kind of whatever economic features that they wanted. And in fact, many moved out west. What the West was not just exclusively for white American settlers. And in terms of Mexican cowboys, territories like Texas, California, some of these areas that had been under Mexican control going back into the 1840s. 1848 was when that territory passed from Mexico to the hands of the United States. And so you'd already had a cattle industry there before the United States even acquired that territory. A second thing that we can say about the reality of being a cowboy was that it really was not all that it was up to be. Being a cowboy was very, very difficult. It was low pay, it was uncomfortable, it was long hours, it was isolation. And so we get, kind of the portrayal of the cowboy in films and popular culture that it's, gambling and drinking and prostitution and gunfights, it's adventure. The reality was is that, this was a low paying job, long hours, spending all of your time with animals all day, living in relative isolation because it's not a very sparsely populated area. And in fact, most people who were cowboys ended up actually leaving their jobs within probably about a year or two. So again, there's a certain myth and reality to the cowboy of the West. Section 6, the Allotment era and resistance in the native West. So, in this section, we're introduced to what might be the most important law kind of in all of this chapter, and that is the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act represents kind of a lot of different themes coming together at a crossroads. It demonstrates policies of assimilation, which were emphasized in this period, perhaps maybe a lot more than in the past. And it mentions in some ways kind of maybe good intentions gone bad, might be kind of a good way of putting it. Good intentions, maybe having harm is maybe a better way of putting it. So, what the Dawes Act was designed to do was it was a policy that would reorganize land on reservations. Essentially, it would turn communal land on reservations into individual homesteads. And this was kind of based off of the Homestead Act. But a homestead would be an individual family would own a single plot of land, kind of like private property. And the idea behind the Dawes Act were, a couple of things. First and foremost, this was a policy of assimilation. So when it came to land use, again, Native Americans tended to use land more communally, whereas Americans tended to use it more individually. So by forcing Native Americans to kind of be individual household units, this was a way to assimilate Native Americans into American society. It was also born out of the fact that there were many people who believed that reservations, we might say reservations, were not land efficient. That is, for the number of people that inhabited many of these reservations, some Americans came to believe that the land was being quote unquote wasted. But we have to keep in mind that Native Americans didn't use the land the same way that Americans did. Things like hunting require a lot of land as opposed to something just like one individual farmstead. And so not only was the Dawes Act, we might say, harmful in the way that it undermined Native American culture and just kind of further distanced Native Americans from their way of life and maintaining some sort of sovereignty. But what was especially damaging about the Dawes Act was kind of the second part of it, and that was any leftover land would be sold. And when we look at the Dawes Act in its totality, one of the consequences that happens is that Native American land shrink pretty dramatically. I mean, you could say in some sense that the end kind of consequence of the Dawes Act is essentially a land grab because once each individual Native American family was given their own individual plot of land on these reservations, all the land left over was just sold. And so, take a step back and kind of look at it with a bird's eye view. Essentially, what happens from the Dawes Act, aside from the whole point on assimilation, which, definitely want to mention that point, was that the number or the amount of land that Native Americans had control over was almost, cut in half as a result of this. So those that were advocating the Dawes Act, you could certainly say that some of them had good intention. Probably not all of them. There certainly probably were people who were kind of eager to maybe acquire that territory. But the idea of assimilation was to prevent violence, right? Prevent violence. Now, the last kind of, we might mention in this section here, the last kind of major confrontation between Native Americans and the United States culminates in what's known as the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. And the Wounded Knee Massacre, in some sense, might be considered, although it's not, I mean, you're going to find exceptions to this, but it's just helpful in terms of remembering it. The last stand of Native American sovereignty. After the Wounded Knee Massacre, we could say in some sense that at that point, Native Americans throughout the continental United States were subject to the United States government in some way, shape, or form. The culmination of the Wounded Knee Massacre began with a religious movement known as the Ghost Dance. And this was a religious movement that began to unite Native Americans in the West, across tribal lines. It was a religious movement that really invoked kind of a return to a way of life before European settlement. It envisioned whites vanishing and the bison returning, buffalo returning. European kind of vices like alcohol would also be gone, and so Wovoka, he was the prophet of the Ghost Dance. That when he began to preach this message, this sort of spiritual revival, it began spreading from, I believe he was in Nevada, to really all over the entire West, including Lakota on the Great Plains. And it was a group of Lakota who had made their way to, I want to say it was South Dakota, that were inspired by this Ghost Dance movement. This was a group of about maybe 400 or so Lakota that were, moving from one area to another, but they were being closely supervised by the United States military. At Wounded Knee in 1890, an attempt to disarm. And we also got to consider that the Ghost Dance movement, in some sense, was also seen as a threat by the United States, that if there was this spiritual movement that could potentially unite different groups and different tribes of Native Americans who were still exercising some degree of sovereignty together, that would be a great threat to the United States. And so there certainly was an element that the Ghost Dance was kind of an emergency that needed to be tended to. So when the United States government attempted to disarm this band of Lakota who had been subscribing to the Ghost Dance movement, that's when the massacre transpired. So we'll say an attempt to disarm Lakota resulted in 150 to 300 Native Americans being killed. And although there were some pockets of resistance that continued throughout the United States, probably most infamously those led by Geronimo in the American Southwest, generally speaking, if we want to kind of simplify it in terms of just like a survey course, we would typically say that once those Lakota were massacred and apprehended at Wounded Knee in 1890, that was the ending of Native American sovereignty in science. Section 7, Rodeos, Wild West shows, and the Mythic American West. So in terms of the West, there was kind of a reality of the West, and this applies a little bit to what we had mentioned in terms of the cowboy. There was a reality of what the West was, and then there was kind of the myth of it. And at the time, the way that many Americans understood the West was a little bit more on this sort of mythic side. And almost immediately, the West kind of, inhabited this region in American popular culture that made it kind of the focal point of a lot of entertainment. And there are a lot of different ways in which Americans came to understand the West, from books to magazines to tall tales to word of mouth, and kind of various ways of understanding. One was through rodeos, and rodeos were kind of like we'll sort of call, I don't know, like an entertainment show slash competition based, we'll say, on the quote unquote Western lifestyle, right? To almost make a sport out of the Western lifestyle. So, like a rodeo probably most commonly involves riding a bull, although I don't know if anyone actually rode bulls out west for any particular reason. Horse riding, it might involve like roping a cattle. And audiences in the East who are not in the West might get exposed or might think they understand what the West is like by attending one of these rodeos. Probably one of the more famous events or spectacles involving the West was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And this was a traveling show that featured, again, kind of rodeo themes, sharpshooters, performances, etc., etc. And kind of the point here is that, in terms of, asking the average everyday American, oh, tell me what you know about the West, well, they would probably get that information from something like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. In fact, Buffalo Bill, who was like the creator of this traveling kind of circus, we might describe, had kind of reoccurring characters. So people like Calamity Jane or Annie Oakley became kind of minor celebrities of the day. Buffalo Bill also included actual Native Americans in these performances. And so, while yes, there was certainly kind of a showmanship and kind of a fakeness to it, there was some genuine aspects of it, including those who actually performed in it. Annie Oakley was a famous female sharpshooter, and she would be featured in some of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows. There's a good word that we can use to describe kind of the way that Americans interacted with the West, and that is romanticization. And this really held true not just for the time period, but even for decades afterwards. To romanticize about something is to kind of think about it in a very kind of nostalgic way. That is to maybe focus on the entertaining or interesting aspects. We might say to maybe bend reality. Again, the cowboy is a great example of this. The way the cowboy was romanticized, even to some degree, the relationship between Native Americans and the United States and settlers was romanticized. So, in terms of how Americans were informed about the West, again, through popular culture, literature, entertainment shows, this was how Americans understood it for a very long time. And this even translated too into, other time periods. Like by the time that radio was invented, one of the more popular shows on radio was Wild West shows. When movies and TV were invented, Wild West shows were one of the most popular genres. Those things have gone kind of out of style recently, but at least for a time period, they remained a focal point in American popular culture. And again, they weren't always depicted accurately. In fact, they were not depicted accurately, is probably a better way of putting it. On to the last section here, section 8, the West is history, the Turner thesis. This section here kind of does a good job of wrapping everything up. In 1893, a historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, wrote a paper called that's what he argues, but he wrote a paper called The Frontier Thesis. And in that paper, he talked about really the kind of the way that the West was equated to what it meant to be American. that really the West defined the United States. Ever since early colonization, everything of the West was true. But by 1893, because of technology, because of the railroads, because of the rapid settlement and expansion and resource extraction that occurred out west, what Turner said in this frontier thesis was essentially by 1893, the frontier was closed. And if we combine that with Wounded Knee in 1890, we might be able to think of this period as being the closing of a chapter in American history. That this idea of the West, as it was understood really ever since the beginning, it's essentially closed. It's been settled. It's been conquered. It's been developed, whatever term that you want to describe. Native Americans have been subjected to the United States government. There is no more sovereignty. So this proved in some ways to be kind of an identity crisis for the United States. Now, again, at the time, this, the fact that the frontier was closed was celebrated. Terminology that was used by those was uncivilized and civilized. They also believed in, quote, the march of progress. So again, to kind of bring it back to the beginning, these sort of things of triumphs and tragedies, the fact that the frontier was closed was both of these things, right? It was a triumph in terms of the way that contemporaries viewed it, but it was also a tragedy in the sense of, well, in a lot of senses, right? In the sense of what it meant for Native American sovereignty. It was a tragedy in terms of what it meant to be an American, how the United States defined itself. And, this image here, I think, does kind of a good job of visualizing the United States kind of on the cusp of two worlds, right? One, we have a Native American man who you could see as elderly, and he very much represents kind of an older way of life where Native Americans were sovereign and had had independence. And then you see this woman here with some sort of recording device, which in a lot of ways kind of represents the technology of the Gilded Age. And this is sort of a new era of technological advancements. And even the photo itself is an attempt to get the recorded recollection of those who lived from an earlier time before it was too late. Presumably, this man here is he's to tell a story about an era that no longer exists. And so when we think about the history of the West, however we want to define it, if we want to define it from the period where contact was made by Christopher Columbus in 1492 all the way until 1890 or 1893, I mean, this is, what's the math on that? This is 400 years, essentially, of a historical chapter between settlers and Native Americans that is effectively coming to an end.